Hello, everyone. It's 1:20 here on the East Coast, so I'd like to reconvene for the final panel of this conference put on by the program on Japanese politics and society here at Indiana University. I am Hilary Holbrow, and I'm assistant professor of Japanese politics and society here in the Hamilton Lugar School, and I'm delighted to introduce our very talented final panel. Our first speaker today will be Professor Ko Maeda, who is zooming in with us from North Texas University, where he's an associate professor of political science. He will be speaking with us today about domestic politics and U.S. Japan relations under Biden and Kishida. Our second speaker today will be Kazuyo Kato. She is executive director of the Japan Center for International Exchange in the United States, and she will be speaking with us about U.S. Japan cooperation in the domain of public health. Next, we will be hearing from Professor Ulrike Scheda, a professor of Japanese business and director of the Japan Forum for Innovation and Technology at the UC San Diego School of Global Policy and Strategy. And Professor Scheda will be speaking with us on digital transformation and U.S.-Japan business cooperation. I will be wrapping up our panel with some remarks on gender policies in Japan and the United States. So without further ado, I will turn things over to Ko. Take it away. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, I thought I got used to Zoom by now. But thank you for kind introduction, and thank you everyone for being here today. I am Ko Maeda at the University of North Texas. My research is on electoral politics, and I tend to believe that policy decisions, including foreign policy decisions, are usually based on domestic electoral consideration. So let me explain Japan's domestic electoral situation and how that may influence Kishida's policy decisions and U.S.-Japan relations in the next few years. So Prime Minister Kishida says he wants to strengthen the U.S.-Japan alliance, and that's basically what all LDP prime ministers say. Will it be possible? In other words, can something happen that causes a problem in the U.S.-Japan relations? One concern is whether a series of short-tenured prime ministers may start again. In that case, a strong personal bond between leaders cannot be developed. Another point is about opposition parties. Japan's opposition parties in general are less enthusiastic about the U.S.-Japan alliance. In 2007, the opposition parties took a majority in the House of Councillors, and they used that majority to force the government to suspend the self-defense force mission in the Indian Ocean to provide logistical assistance to the US and allied naval vessels engaged in the anti-terrorism operation in Afghanistan. And the US government was very unhappy about the suspension of the mission. But as I will explain, both of these possibilities are very unlikely. So let me explain the ruling coalition of the LDP and Komeito just won another House of Representatives election in October. And they currently have a little less than 2/3 of the seats in that chamber. The next important election will be in July this year for the House of Councillors. That chamber has an election every 3 years, renewing half of its members each time. The ruling coalition seat share in the House of Councillors is much smaller than that in the House of Representatives, as you can see in this graph. Maintaining a majority and possibly increasing its seat share in the House of Councillors must be the biggest concern for Kishida right now. If he wins it, then he will not need to face a national election until 2025. But if he loses, then he might have to resign. That's becoming another short tenured prime minister. But so far, Kishida has not made his foreign policy agendas very clearly, even though he is experienced and knowledgeable about foreign issues. And this is just my guess, but maybe that is intentional. He may be trying to portray himself as a modest and competent leader, not bold and divisive. That way, the upcoming election will not be based on a divisive policy issue, and it will be less likely for the opposition parties to get united going into the election. So the big question right now is if the coalition can win the House of Councillors majority in July. My short answer is, unless something big and unexpected happens, that's highly likely. Here, the last 5 House of Councillors election results are shown. There have been fluctuations, but the coalition has been winning at least 57% of seats in the last 3 elections, and the basic structure of electoral competition has not changed. That is, the opposition camp is divided, and none of them is generally seen as a credible alternative as a ruling party. Thus, in order to win a bare majority in the House of Councillors, the coalition needs to win only 47% of the seats, which is a low bar to clear. Then after that, again, there will not have to be a national election until 2025. But before that, Kishida's current 3-year term as the president of the LDP will end in September 2024, right before the US presidential election. He will be 67 years old then, and that's not too old. So he will, of course, seek his second term. So he will be thinking about this race. His strategy toward this race will guide his policy decisions as prime minister. And also he will have to decide whether to call an early House of Representatives election before that or not. But regardless of the timing of the next House of Representatives election, it is certain that he must keep thinking about the LDP leadership race in 2024, and that will influence his policies. Okay, then who will challenge Kishida? It seems that the conservative wing within the party has been pretty active and energized recently, and Shinzo Abe is the de facto leader of that wing. In the leadership election last year, Abe supported Takaichi, who has been taking a pretty conservative position within the party. Even though she didn't win the race, she was able to attract conservative party member support and consolidate her position as the next face of the party's conservative wing. And she seems ambitious. She seems to want to become the first female prime minister of the country. Naturally, Abe wants to remain influential within the party, and for that, he will need to keep the conservative wing of the party energized. And for that purpose, Abe needs Takaichi. And of course, Takaichi needs Abe's support. Then Kishida will need to strategize his move. He might decide to move closer to Takaichi's conservative position so that he will not antagonize the party's conservative wing. But I don't know. But at least Kishida will be making policy decisions while thinking about his potential rivals within his party. And that much I can say with confidence. And thank you. That's it for me.
Thank you so much, Ko, for that insightful analysis. I would also like to add, for members of our audience, if you have questions at any time, please feel free to put them in the Q&A now, and I will be drawing on those when all 4 presenters have finished their presentations. In the meantime, I would like to hand things off to Kazuyo Kato for her presentation on public health.
Thank you, Hillary. Thank you so much for letting me join on this wonderful panel. I'm really grateful. So I work for a U.S. nonprofit organization promoting U.S. Japan policy dialogues on issues like global health, and I've been asked to talk about U.S. Japan collaboration on global health. And I'll focus on the issue of the global pandemic today as a challenge that the US and Japan have been compelled to address both at home and abroad. And I'd like to start with why we talk about global health as an area for collaboration in general. There's, of course, a strong rationale for the world's first and third largest economies to work together, but it's also because the concept and expectations for the US-Japan alliance has evolved over the years to serve not only as a military alliance serving bilateral issues, but also as a global partnership, understanding that we, of course, cannot take the strength of the alliance for granted or ignore bilateral issues. And it's expected as a global partnership that can strengthen its credibility and soft power by serving the rest of the world, as Consul General Tajima mentioned, to protect a free and rules-based international community and basic principles like people's dignity and welfare, including health security. And on global health, Japan has led this alliance in this regard for many decades by promoting this principle of universal health coverage as its foreign policy priority to provide all people access to affordable and quality health care. And in fact, the two countries have a track record in official partnerships, as well as in exchanges and research collaboration on health and science since the early 1990s, as well as in coordinated support to leading global health organizations like the Global Fund to Fight AIDS, Tuberculosis, and Malaria, which are three infectious diseases that existed way before COVID. Focusing on the US-Japan alliance collaboration on the global response to COVID, as background, addressing this global inequity in access to tools that are essential to fight COVID remains a global health priority. And these include not only vaccines, but also testing kits, personal protective equipment, oxygen, and treatments, and another essential component we can't ignore, which is strong health systems and workforce to deliver those tools to the people. By now, we all probably appreciate that safety abroad means safety at home because viruses can mutate and produce variants and travel across borders. But the international community has so far failed to address this reality. And while more than 70% of the population in richer countries are fully vaccinated, it's less than 6% in poorer countries. There is a global collaboration framework among public health agencies that's led by the World Health Organization, but the framework is facing a 16 billion funding gap in pledges from richer countries. Now, the US and Japan's response to this problem indicate that they recognize this issue as a national security and economic issue, as well as a geostrategic concern as it relates to some competition in vaccine diplomacy. And it's not just about fulfilling a moral obligation. And based on these drivers, both countries have used multilateral, regional, and bilateral channels to make contributions, both in the form of financial commitments, as well as vaccine dose donations and enhancements in ODA. The US is the largest donor by far. Japan's funding commitment has been much smaller, but it was one of the earlier funders to the multilateral effort. And the two countries have jointly acted to coordinate their regional response through the Quad framework that the earlier panels have discussed at length, and previously partnered in a multilateral setting, such as by opening and closing the COVAX Pledging Summit last year. Despite their respective contributions, the US and Japan have not exhausted all the options to do more, and especially to do more jointly to visibly show their partnership and leadership on the global stage, both in the current response as well as in future pandemic preparedness. And I'll end with 3 suggestions on how to do more. First is by having Japan project more political leadership alongside the US. President Biden has visibly asserted that the US will be the world's arsenal of vaccines and rallied other world leaders to do more by hosting the global COVID-19 summit, which he'll host again next month. But critics will say that Japan has not projected the commitment that's proportional to its stature as the world's 3rd largest economy and the champion of universal health coverage. And one opportunity to do that or counter that may be to pledge additional funding at the next COVID summit. But political leadership is not only about increasing ODA and government funding. It can also be to signal national priorities and mobilize other sectors of society, including the private sector and the scientific community, to work together and be part of the solution. Because global health is a cross-sectoral issue that requires a collaboration across multiple sectors. And in this regard, the Japanese government is already actually developing its national global health strategies to be released in June. And second, political leaders can then, on both sides, can promote U.S.-Japan exchanges to share data, lessons learned, knowledge, and expertise across these different sectors. And for example, in addition to scientific and technical exchanges, the development agencies can coordinate more closely. One area where Japan has significant expertise in because of its work on universal health coverage and where the US has developed greater appreciation for as a result of COVID is the importance of strengthening health systems and health sector capacity building. And finally, this US-Japan network of collaboration can then support US-Japan global leadership in areas like expanding global manufacturing capacity for vaccines and other tools, and in shaping global health governance, which includes things like WHO reform, international health regulations, and sustainable financing. As an example, the US has pledged seed funding to a new pandemic preparedness fund, and Japan can co-lead that effort. So in conclusion, I'd like to just say that for better or for worse, COVID-19 has been an opportunity and will be a compelling case study to examine how the US and Japan is able to project global leadership and to do more together to address global challenges despite competing national interests and domestic constraints. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that fascinating set of remarks on a hugely important topic. Next, we will be hearing from Professor Maeda on business cooperation between Japan and the United States.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me. I'm just so disappointed that we won't be able to go to lunch after this so that we can continue the conversation. So thank you, Adam, and your colleagues at Hamilton Lugar for arranging this fantastic conference. So let me share my PowerPoints. I'm a business scholar. I can't do anything without them, I guess. Adam asked me to talk a little bit about U.S.-Japan business collaboration. So I didn't really prepare anything on the digital transformation, but those of you who know me know that I can always talk about that. So type away your questions. So here are the 3 points I would like to make in my 8 minutes. And the major takeaway, I hope, from my little interlude here is that it's time to rethink U.S.-Japan business relations. And I want to make that point by telling you that there's 3 times much more than you usually think. There's actually much more business between U.S. and Japan than just the trade data. And the Consul General already said that earlier today, and I'm gonna show you some data on that as well. And there's also much more Japanese business in the US than many people appreciate. And finally, there's much more technology exchange and business collaboration than we may be aware of. I'll also, on my way, make a point that for US-Japan relations, at least, trade is actually a 20th century concept, and it's important, but it's only half of or less than half of the story. And what I'm going to tell you has implications for U.S.-Japan relations, because Japan is so heavily invested in the United States that actually shapes the alliance as well. Okay, so with that, let me show you these 3 points in order. So first, I said it's much more than trade. We're talking about foreign direct investment here, actually. And so here's some charts. This is not the prettiest one, but basically what you see here is the red and blue lines. Red is exports of Japan by export to the United States by Japan and percent of total trade. So in the 80s, when we had a trade war with Japan, the United States accounted for 40% of Japanese exports and over 20% of Japanese imports, and that continued. So imports from the US were more than 20% of total Japanese imports. And for the US as well, Japan was huge. It accounted for 20% of imports and 12% of exports. Now this has gone, oh, I'm sorry, I meant to no, what am I going to do? Not subtitles. I was hoping to have a laser. Let me see if I can do this. Oh, there it is. So over time, this has declined, right? So both for Japan and the US, trade is really not that, it's still important. And for Japan, there's even a little uptake here, which I've worked on in a recent book where I'm looking at the business reinvention of Japan. But fundamentally, the trend lines are down. Here's another way of looking at the same thing, which is the percentage of Japan in the US trade deficit. And at the height of the US-Japan trade war, it was 60%, and now it's less than 10%. So from the US perspective, this means Japan is no longer this important. Let's talk about China, right? And because there's so much interest in well, okay. For the US, the lens should shift. This is my second point, and that is, let's look at not trade, but Japanese investments into the United States. So this is Japanese outward FDI into the United States, and you see that goes up and down with, this is the end of the bubble, there's a global financial crisis, and so things happen. But fundamentally, we see this uptick, right? So if I had drawn an average line, let's say every year Japan puts something like $30 billion foreign direct investment into the United States. And this is the stock, this is accumulated, right? So if we just add this up, then there's over 600 billion Japanese dollars of Japanese investments in the US. Of the total Japanese FDI, in the old days, 60% went into the United States, and more recently, 30% still. The rest of the Japanese FDI goes into Southeast Asia, which is something that already came up in the first panel, and I'd be happy to talk about more as well. All right, so the result of this is that the Japanese economy is no longer just, a trading nation. It is an economy that runs a huge global production network. These are the number of offices and manufacturing plants that Japanese companies have built abroad. So there are more than 40,000, there are almost 40,000, more than 30,000 such plants and offices. And here is, and maybe you've heard this here first, you read a lot in the news about how the Japanese economy is stagnating and GDP is flat and there's no growth and the aging, shrinking society and all of those bad things, and that's true. Japanese GDP is hovering at around 5 trillion and has done so for about a decade. However, Japan's global production network is growing. So if I draw a trend line here, this would also be going up. And it's very difficult to estimate what GNP would actually look like for Japan. But the best data I could find suggests to me that this global production network adds another 3 trillion to Japanese economic activity, which is something like 60%, right? And it could be more than that. So it may also be time to stop talking about Japanese GDP because given the demographic change and so forth, there is something else going on. All right, so let me speed up a little bit. So how does it look like in the United States? Here's this is from my colleague David Chetwin at JNC Solutions, and he's drawn an estimated economic activity by Japan in the United States, and the Consul General already pointed this out, that he's in charge of all of this, which is cars, plastic, rubber, chemicals, and machinery. And then there's Silicon Valley electronics. And so this is manufacturing only. If we do this for all trade, we get the Sobo Shosha in, right? So here are the trading houses and banks. So now the coasts come in importantly, as well as Texas. With energy and other activities in the south. So this is huge, and so Japanese presence in the United States is significant. Let me just give you one data point. The top 3 Japanese car makers employ more workers in the United States than the top 3 American car makers. And then there's, of course, classified stuff. So what I just showed you is a complete underestimation of what's really going on. But since we can't talk about the classified, let's talk about what we can talk about. And I'm going to end here soon, Hillary, no worries. Japan is one of the largest investors in Silicon Valley in terms of corporate venture capital, one of the largest investors in energy and business. Here is the digital transformation. I'll talk about that later. Cybersecurity, as you political scientists know really well. There's the U.S. Japan Cyber Dialogue, the U.S. Japan Cyber Defense Dialogue. And then there are the health sciences, which is a lot of which is stealth. So investments into biotech by Japanese pharmaceutical companies. And the latest big thing is food, believe it or not, vertical farming, impossible beef, artificial beef, and so forth and so on. Okay, so time to wrap up. There's much more than maybe you thought. And the reason there's so much more than you thought is that a lot of this is quiet. There are a lot of things that Japan does that flow into other products, but there's no Japan's inside sticker on your computer, your cell phone, or even your car. So you may not be aware how prominent Japan actually is in many of the everyday products that we use. And so, and the last point is, this has changed Japan's geopolitical strategy into a geoeconomic strategy, right? Because the assets that Japan holds abroad are so huge that one of the biggest activities by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs now is to work on stopping those, protecting those assets. Now, let me see whether I can get back out. Here we go. All right. Thank you very much. And I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Ulrika. I love this idea of like invisible Japan, that the economic products of Japan are everywhere and we don't even realize it. So now I will be wrapping up this panel, and we'll just share my slides here. All right, so we have covered a diverse set of topics in this panel, and I will be rounding this out with a discussion of gender policies in Japan in the United States, looking at the COVID era and beyond. So when we hear about gender issues in Japan in the United States, often the picture that's painted is just incredibly bleak, right? So we see things like this article, which calls Japan's gender equality record appalling. We see articles about the depth and breadth of sexism in Japan, which is so intense that it's even dooming the royal family, this institution that has been around for millennia, literally. And we're constantly being told that few women ascend the corporate ladder in Japan. So universally bleak picture. And there's a lot of statistics that underpin this negative image that we have of gender issues in Japan. For example, there's the fact that the gender wage gap between full-time workers in Japan is 25%, compared to 18% in the United States. And one figure that's particularly striking is the small share managerial positions that are held by women in Japan, 15%, compared to 40% in the United States. But perhaps the most highly publicized number, which there's a lot of coverage of, is this Global Gender Gap Index, which is developed by the World Economic Forum. And it basically agglomerates many different data points to create rankings for basically every country in the world, and then allows some comparison, hypothetically, in gender inequalities across very diverse contexts. And according to this index, Japan ranks 120th out of 156. So this is just the bottom of the barrel, terrible ranking, you know, to be frank. Whereas the United States is, you know, by no means a paragon of virtue in this regard, 30th out of 156, but this is much more respectable. But as I'm going to show you, this World Economic Forum developed gender gap index actually presents quite a misleading and skewed picture of the sort of totality of gender rights and gender inequality in Japan. So now I'll illustrate some things which are not included in the index, which actually then paint Japan in a much more positive light, particularly in comparison to the United States. So one area where Japan really excels is the policies that it has in place to support caregivers. And perhaps the crown jewel of these policies is the extremely generous paid parental leave, which is theoretically available to both men and women in Japan. So you can take a leave of up to a year, and in some cases longer, which will be paid at 2/3 of your salary for part of the time and 50% thereafter, compared to absolutely zero for the great majority of workers in the United States. Another way in which Japan goes very far in supporting caregivers is through very high quality subsidized daycare. So just looking at the average annual cost, this is only 1/3 of US levels in Japan. And for many families, it's actually much cheaper than this because of income subsidies, they don't have to pay the full sticker price, which is already heavily subsidized by the government. And then finally, the maternal mortality rate is only 1/4 of what it is in the US in Japan. So if we look at these measures of well-being of women as mothers and of support for caregivers generally, Japan looks very different. And indeed, the World Economic Forum's Global Gender Gap Index does not include any of these metrics at all. So essentially what this index does is, I'm not claiming that they're doing this deliberately, but the end result is that they're cherry picking statistics where the US looks comparatively positive and Japan looks comparatively bad. And they're excluding areas where Japan does very well, which is why this presents such a misleading picture of gender equality in the two national contexts. And I just want to highlight how important these caregiver support policies are for women's involvement in the labor force. And we can see this if we look at women's labor force participation over time in the US and Japan. And we can see that largely thanks to these caregiver support policies, there's been this steady increase in women's labor force participation in Japan, actually surpassing that of the United States in the past decade or so, whereas women's labor force participation in the United States has stagnated and even declined over the past couple decades. And the COVID-19 pandemic has really underscored and highlighted just how important caregiver policies are for women's labor force participation. And because Japan is so strong in this area, and because it invested even further in this area, Japan has weathered the COVID pandemic without as much exacerbation of gender inequality as we've seen in the United States. And some ways that this has occurred, so I will just give a very, very brief overview of some of the ways in which the two countries have handled this differently. So for example, We all know that the COVID pandemic forced school closures and daycare closures around the world. But in the United States, these initial closures were very long. So they started in March and in many cases lasted until August or September. Whereas in Japan, this initial period of closures was much shorter, with most kids being back in school by the end of May 2020. So, a period of 2 months or 6 weeks where schools were closed completely, compared to 5 months in the United States. And then once schools went back in session, many US school districts relied predominantly on remote schooling for the entirety of the 2020-21 school year. Whereas in Japan, remote schooling was almost never used, except for perhaps a few private schools. So obviously, with these two sets of policies, Japan made it much easier for people with caregiving responsibilities to remain in the workforce. And then the way that the two countries handled caregiver wage replacement also allowed women to keep their jobs to a higher degree in Japan than in the US. The primary difference being that the US caregiver wage replacement programs expired in the end of 2020 and were not renewed, whereas Japan's were repeatedly renewed as the pandemic went on. And in any case, an individual's participation in the program was capped at 12 weeks in the United States, which obviously doesn't even cover this entire first 5 month period of school closures for most people. Whereas in Japan, although school closures were not long, if your school or daycare had to close repeatedly, you could continue to use this program as long as you needed it. And so we can see the effects of this in how women's labor force participation has changed over the course of the pandemic in both countries. So we can see in the United States, at the start of the pandemic, there was a very steep drop off, and that's been followed by a recovery, which has been, first of all, very gradual and is still incomplete. In contrast, Japan saw a dip, which was much less steep in the beginning, followed by a complete recovery. So in conclusion, I think COVID has highlighted the importance of caregiver-focused policies for women's labor market opportunities. And Japan's policies have been much more supportive of caregivers, both before and during the pandemic. So I think it's really time to retire this idea of Japan as inherently more unfriendly to working women than the United States, or inherently more gender unequal. Because although women in the US do enjoy better access to elite professional and managerial jobs, outside that, admittedly quite narrow milieu, Japan's policies are actually serving more women more effectively. All right, so I will end my presentation there. And now I think I will take the chair's prerogative to ask a few questions of the panel. And I actually saw a question in the chat here, which picks up on an issue that I wanted to ask about as well. So I'll read the question and then I'll just expand on that a little bit. This question comes from Masayuki Shida, who's an undergraduate student studying international relations at American University. And he says, in strengthening collaboration on global health between the US and Japan, are there any possible obstacles resulting from domestic affairs in Japan? And so I would like to pose this question both to Kazuyo and to Ko, and ask you to reflect on, not just in Japan, but also in the United States, how domestic politics affect the willingness to engage in global public health cooperation, particularly in areas around vaccine and COVID. But not just the willingness, but also the degree or the level of commitment to those goals. Would either of you like to volunteer to go first?
I can go first, perhaps. In terms of the impact of domestic politics on U.S.-Japan responses to global health, on the U.S. side, it has created some fluctuations with regards to COVID response. So if you recall 2020, the U.S. was largely absent in the global response under the Trump administration, but that actually allowed Japan to sort of highlight its global leadership, because Japan was one of the earlier funders to the multilateral effort, as I mentioned. And on the Japanese side, it's been more consistent and stable in terms of political leadership. But as every other country, it's dealing with multiple competing interests at home and also on global issues, is including not just global health, but climate change, for example. And Prime Minister Kishida has been known to be more sympathetic to these issues of global health, but we, as I mentioned, we haven't seen a strong political commitment as we would expect. I would just mention that on the other hand, the Policy Research Council of the LDP's coalition party, the Komeito party, just launched a committee to promote global health earlier this month. So this coalition together it'll be interesting to see how they would respond to this area as a coalition.
Okay, it's hard to say without looking at exact detailed public opinion survey data, but it seems to me, I mean, if there is a domestic obstacle for global cooperation in health issues, that may be the anti-foreigner kind of attitude. We should care about our own people. We don't care about outside. But just my impression, but in Japan, that kind of sentiment is not so big. So in that sense, I don't see much obstacle.
Oh, thank you. So I will now direct a question to Ulrika. And I was really struck in your presentation by how similar to what I was talking about, how there's this strong narrative, both domestically and internationally, about Japan as a country in decline, you know, as you say, a stagnant GDP, declining population, and so on. But on the other hand, there's this whole side of what I called earlier invisible Japan, where Japan's gross national product is actually growing. And I'm wondering why there's not more attention paid to that fact. So any insights you might have into that would be very helpful.
Yeah, that is a great question. And I'll direct it right back to you. What you think, why? I mean, I was really struck when you said that the statistics that compare Japan to other places often pick items where, yeah, Japan doesn't look good, whether that's, you know, overtime work or, you know, or women in managerial positions. But it doesn't pick things where Japan does look good. And I think that's because Japan's model is very different. And so the people who put these statistics together, and you were very careful to say that that's not maybe not even design. They may unwittingly do this because they take the economy they know, they take some of the markers that we look at, and they say, oh, look, Japan is bad. But they don't look at the other things, right, where Japan is actually good, so we don't get a balanced view. And so part of it is just that the Japanese model is so different that we don't have that on our radar, and so we don't look for it, right? The other thing might be that, you know, there's still a lot of people who like to hear bad news about Japan. It makes us feel so much better. And, you know, it doesn't make, you know, I don't know whether it's a little bit facetious, but sometimes I get that in the newspapers, right? The stories that I read about Japan in the news are either about how Japan is failing or weird in some way, shape, or form. And, you know, I don't know, you know, the manga or otaku or something like that. And there's a whole fascination around that, when in fact, there could be a lot of reporting to be done about how Japan has found a solution to problems that we have. And we don't see that. We don't see that in the news a lot. And I really honestly don't, good news don't sell, maybe.
Thank you. Yeah, and I agree on this point that I think there's a big market in the United States and perhaps other English-speaking countries as well for the formula of using Japan to make us feel good about ourselves. So I think the stories where we're kind of pointing the finger at Japan and saying, look how messed up this is really a way about bolstering our own self-image and national pride. And I've heard that type of reporting described as sort of neo-Orientalism or techno-Orientalism. And I always direct my students to read newspaper articles about Japan written in English with a very critical eye for those types of themes. All right, so we do have a number of questions in the chat, but I would just like to take Chair's prerogative again to direct one more question to the panel. And this question is for Ko in particular. And because I study gender, I see that successive LDP administrations have put a lot of emphasis in increasing women's representation in leadership positions and increasing women's labor force participation. And I'm wondering how that appeals or does not appeal to voters. Is this something that voters are interested in, or is this something that the government is primarily doing to appeal to international audiences that have been very critical of Japan in this regard?
Interesting question and a difficult question to answer. That's something really, I really need to look at public opinion survey data. It's hard to say. Both the LDP and the largest opposition Constitutional Democratic Party both had a female candidate for the leadership last year, and then still males are at the top. But what would happen? What would happen if a female leader takes over? And then those two female candidates for the party leadership, they are still serving near the top of the party, and clearly the parties are trying to use those images to get voters support. It'll be interesting. I have no clear answer right now. I like to know more by looking at the survey data.
Yeah, on that point of female leadership, actually, the number of years in the past 50 in which there has been a female head of state is one of the data points that goes into constructing this World Economic Forum Global Gender Gap Index. So countries that have ever had a female head of state just shoot up in the rankings, which I think is one of the problems with this metric, that just one single person, obviously a very powerful person, but one person nonetheless can have such a huge sway on where you fall in these rankings. All right. So with that, I would like to turn to some of the questions in the chat. And I guess I'll turn first to a question from Terrence Roerig. And it looks like this is a question directed to Ulrika. It says, what is your assessment of the recent report that Taiwan and South Korea will overtake Japan's GDP per capita by 2050?
Yeah, that's one of these measures, right? GDP per capita, that is exactly what we were just talking about. Yes, Japan used to have the highest or the second highest after the US or something like that, and that's going down, and that's because the GDP is flat, and GDP is flat because Japanese companies are producing abroad. And so, now the society is shrinking, but that's also true for Korea. And so, we have to ask the same question for Korea: is GDP per capita going up because of the aging and shrinking society, or because they're repatriating some of the production that they had outsourced to China, or what is going on? So, just as such a as a measure, it's not clear to me what that means. And I think it's another one of these 20th century metrics that were important then, and it's still important to a certain degree. What it doesn't measure is the stock. So I've talked to my economist colleagues a lot about this, right? So we use GDP because it changes every year. And so we can measure it. And then we say, oh, it's up or it's down or it's the same, right? So we're very good at tracking the growth. What we're really not good at is assessing the stock. Let's say, in my humble opinion, the Tokyo subway is the nicest subway in the world. The Shinkansen system is the best train system in the world, and the houses and the streets are clean and whatnot. We have no way of measuring that. So we're taking a country that has a very, very high level of affluence and has stopped growing and say, look, it's falling. Well, it's not falling behind. It's just at a very high level of affluence, and a lot of the activity is the economic activity has been located outside of Japan. So it's an interesting point to look at, but we have to be careful that we don't overstate its relevance for understanding the economies in Asia.
Thank you. So if I can just piggyback on that question, I'm also wondering, this Japan's rising GNP and its increasing production in other countries, does this create increases in prosperity for Japanese citizens living in Japan? And I recognize that any answer is probably going to be somewhat speculative, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Japanese companies are actually repatriating a lot of their profits. So yes, but it's not counted as a domestic activity, right? And so yeah, it is benefiting, and it is benefiting also. There's this long discussion. We could have a whole hour on lifetime employment, and is it going to go away? Is it still there? The reality right now is that 65% of the employed Japanese workforce still enjoys 100% job security. And how do you do that through a COVID crisis? Well, you repatriate profits, and you have a stash for a rainy day, and you pay attention to this matter. It's part of the social contract. So I'm sure many companies in Japan would like to lay off people, but that would be very expensive and reputation, and they would not be allowed to. So again, a great question. And yes, Japanese people do benefit, from this global production network that Japan is building.
Thank you. And on the question of lifetime employment, my read of the situation is that lifetime employment is as strong as ever. So it's heartening to hear other people reading the situation in the same way, because we've been hearing for the past 40 years that permanent employment is on the verge of disappearing, and those predictions have been disproved again and again. So I think history alone suggests that this is not going to disappear overnight, right?
Could I just footnote that the future will also predict this, because Japan will have a labor shortage because of the shrinking society. And if you're a CEO of a company, what you're doing right now is you're offering the best of jobs to the best and brightest. And the power of the best and brightest in Japan has greatly increased. As somebody said the other day, this would be a great time to be a 23-year-old Japanese.
It's funny that you should mention that, because I was just before we started this panel, I was looking at the number of people between the age of 20 years and 24 years in Japan, and looking at when it peaked, and it peaked in 1971. So the population of young people entering their first jobs is smaller than it's ever been, giving each one of those people as individuals more power than ever before to demand the working conditions that they want. All right. Yeah, Ulrika, I see we could chat about permanent employment for a very long time, but I would like to let the other panelists have a chance to answer some of these questions. And we have here a question from Daniel Schneider for Co. And Daniel is asking, if Kishida wins a decisive victory in the upper house election, will we see a move to separate himself and his allies from the Abe, Aso, Takaichi wing of the party? And what would that mean for Japanese foreign policy, particularly relations with China and Korea?
Okay, so that will really depend on how, why the LDP wins a decisive victory? Is that because of Kishida's personal popularity, or the CDP and Ishin just hurt each other? It depends on it. But anyway, if Kishida wins big this summer, that will really boost his authority within the party. Then the next challenge is the Okinawa gubernatorial elections this fall. So recently, the anti-US based side in Okinawa is becoming somewhat weaker electorally. So the LDP may see it as a big chance to win the governorship of Okinawa. If the LDP wins it, that will be a huge deal for the party. Then the Kishida's authority will be like skyrocketing. In that case, Kishida will probably look for early election for the House of Representatives. Nowadays, as my earlier research shows, the party leader's personal popularity really matters for individual candidates' electoral fortunes. So individual politicians, especially younger ones, they just want to have a leader who will be strong in elections. Then the Kishida will have a free hand. Now, what will he do then? It really depends on what as a person he wants to do and what kind of legacy he wants to leave. We don't know, but he will have a really free hand. He can do whatever he wants to do. So then we would find out then.
Thank you, Ko. I would now like to direct a question to Kazuyo that once again is linking some of the various themes that we've covered in this panel, and thinking about global health outreach by Japan and international cooperation in that area between Japan and the United States. Do you see gender issues being discussed as a facet of these types of cooperation, and if so, in what ways?
Yeah, definitely. By the way, I was just thinking about your question about LDP sincerity, and having worked in both US and Japan as a woman originally from Japan, I do think there is some benefit to having women in visible positions as role models for the future generation of women. And so I do think that's been helpful for people like me, for example. But I do also agree that there are more similarities and differences, more similarities than differences between the US and Japan, as you kind of try to highlight. And this gets to the answer to your question. I do think because there are so many similarities in the challenges that women face in both countries, there's a lot of benefit to greater exchanges on certain issues. And I would just mention in the global health area or women's health area, first of all, in perspective, US and Japanese development agencies have been contributing to women around the world in areas like reproductive health rights and family planning issues. But even for women in their respective countries, we now have a minister for women's empowerment who's a female in Japan. And she recently announced the establishment of an all-parliamentary group on to promote femtech, which is a female stands for female in technologies. So the goal is to promote latest technologies to address products and services that develop products and services that address female-specific health issues, and so including reproductive health and family treatments. So I do think there is a lot that the U.S. can inform Japan in these kinds of areas. And I think in addition to women, the health of the aging population is another area where the two countries can really benefit from exchanges. And finally, we talked about technology exchange and scientific exchange as being important between the two. And I would just say that there's much focus on the issue of promoting education on STEM fields and supporting women in these fields. So I think those are the areas that the two countries can work on.
Thank you. All right. I think we have time for one final question from the audience queue here. And I see a question from Deanna Horton, and this is directed at Ulrika. Deanna writes, I agree that trade is a 20th century concept. To what extent are the exports of Japan branded companies in China responsible for the downturn in Japan exports?
So Japanese exports to the US are down. Japanese exports overall are actually going up. And Japan is exporting a lot within Asia. So what happened in Asia what has happened there over the last 20 years is that Japanese companies have relinquished the consumer end product markets, more or less. Not quite yet. You can still buy a Panasonic oven toaster or blow dryer or something, but not really. So Japanese companies have exited markets that are directed at the consumer, at the end consumer, which is why we don't see it anymore. So it used to be you would walk into your neighbor's house and it would be a Sony TV and that sort of thing, and now it's an LG TV or something. But at the same time, Japanese companies have pivoted to produce the fine chemicals that go into these electronics. And so if you look at the trade within Asia and the whole sort of global supply chains within Asia, it turns out that South Korea and Taiwan have a trade deficit with Japan, and China has a trade deficit with South Korea and Taiwan. So what happens there is that Japan makes the fine chemicals, those are shipped to Japan and to South Korea and Taiwan, and they make the parts, and then the parts get shipped to China, and then we buy whether that's branded with a Japanese brand or not, we buy something from China, and that enters our statistics as an import from China, even if it actually can be traced to be 40% from Japan and 30% from Korea, right? And the iPhone is probably the biggest example of that sort of thing. So it's very complicated now to even look at these trade data. So a lot of people are trying to figure this out, but our customs folks just can't take every iPhone or every product apart and say, oh, how much of this is actually from Japan, right? So we'll just count this as China. So trade is still important. It's just for the U.S. Japan relation that it's no longer that important, but the Japan exports to China are clearly up. And by the way, if we had tie this back to the panel in the morning, this is another one of these stabilizing factors in the area, in the region, right? That there's so much interdependence on those global supply chains that for America are a little bit nebulous, but everybody in Asia understands. And so even Japan and China, of course, have their history and their troubles and their problems, and they everything indicates that they don't like each other much. But when it comes to business, oh, that's easy, right? We need each other. And so it's easier, let's say. It's they need each other, and there are these dependencies. So it's a great question, and I could give a whole lecture on this, but let me not hog too much time here. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panels for a really stimulating and interesting cross-cutting set of remarks. And I really appreciate, Ulrika, you're bringing this back to the panels that we heard earlier this morning as well. Apologies to those members of the audience whose questions we were not able to get to. But we're at the end of our time now. So I would just like to once again thank our panelists and then turn things over to my colleague, Adam Liff, for some final wrap-up remarks.
All right, thank you so much, Hillary, and thank you to all of you. What a fantastic panel. You packed a tremendous amount into just 60 minutes, and I too wish we could all gather for lunch to continue the conversation. Alas, we're online, and we've now reached the end of our virtual conference on U.S.-Japan relations. To our audience, thank you for spending a big part of your Friday with us. To those of you who have been around since the first session, I admire your stamina, and it inspires and energizes me to do this again sometime soon. I'd also like to again thank all our panelists, moderators, the Consul General and his colleagues from the Chicago Consulate, especially Rie Arai, and of course the Japan Foundation Center for Global Partnership for the generous support. Lastly, I'd like to express my gratitude to all the staff and students here at Indiana University and beyond who attended and contributed in ways large and small to making today's conference such a success. And just one final word, I'd like to offer special thanks to Evan Wright and Rachel Grussing for their help with preparations and behind the scenes. Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone, and goodbye.